All right, so jumping into the real meat of this course, macroeconomics, the bird's eye view. And so supply and demand, they play a factor in all of the chapters that we're going to be talking about, which is why we go over them first. But this chapter is kind of a historical chapter. There's a lot of, storytelling. There's a lot of facts, and it's for a purpose. It's for a purpose. So, why does macroeconomics exist? So it's actually a relatively new science. It's only about 100 years old. And so the answer to this question is this thing that happened, you might have heard of it, called the Great Depression. And so the Great Depression was a very dark period globally, not just for the United States, to kind of give you some imagery, of what happened. Factories cut production by 31%. So nearly a third of all factories shut down, or the factories that were in operation stopped producing a third of what they were producing. The number of people without jobs, so the jobless rate, tripled in 1933 to 25%. So 1 in every 4 adult Americans did not have a job and were looking for a job. And the last thing to really show how bad this was, the stock market, so the valuation of all of the public companies in the United States, lost a third of their value in 3 weeks. I mean, this was so bad, stockbrokers were jumping out of buildings. They were so distraught by the fact that they'd lost all their money and they'd lost all their clients' money. And yeah, so it was a really, really dark time. There were no real safety nets, so you had a lot of elderly people on the streets begging for money, selling, apples or potatoes or something, just trying to just do anything to make ends meet. And it wasn't just in the United States, right? So this was in the US. But also, if we look to Germany, in Germany, nearly a third of workers were without jobs. And in Germany, they had a total banking system collapse. And we'll talk about what that entails in the future. And so, if you guys were taught anything about the Great Depression, which you might have been, you were probably taught that the cause of it was the stock market, right? And there's other people that say, well, it's just the nature of capitalism for these types of events to happen, these types of downturns. Or was it poor economic planning? Did the government, spend a bunch of money on a bunch of useless stuff? Right, as we see sometimes in Latin American countries and African countries. So again, this was the birth of economics, and so the birth of macroeconomics, right? So the answer or the response, was actually that it was bad macroeconomic policies. Or lack thereof. And what are these macroeconomic policies? These are government actions designed to affect the performance of the economy as a whole. And so when the government is looking at, policies, what policies they should put into place, well, what are they going to look at in terms of a metric, right? What are they going to look at in terms of, well, how well are people doing? So to answer that question of how well people are doing, we have this notion called the standard of living. And so the standard of living is the degree to which people have access to the goods and services that make their lives easier, healthier, safer, and just more enjoyable. And so in this context, economic growth is talking about this steady increase in both the quantity and the quality of those goods and services. And, for the most part, we've done that. All right, so in 2019, U.S. output was, 16 times 1929 level. And it was 4 times the 1965 level. So, we've been doing it. And at the end of the day, this standard of living, it's not the best, but it's not perfect, but it's the best measure that we have. And so part of economic growth is, the goods and services that make lives easier, healthier, safer, more enjoyable, right? And so, some of the recent polls of Americans show that, in the U.S., I think it was in 2019, they said that 96% of Americans own a cell phone. I think it was 2016 were these other numbers, where it was 87% of households own a computer. 77% have internet access. So these are all metrics of standard of living, right? They have access to these technologies that, 10, 20 years ago, we had no idea were even available, that make our lives easier, better, more enjoyable. And sometimes this increase in the goods and services production, the goods and services consumption, is accompanied by an increase in other things, like our knowledge, like our skills. So, in the United States, nowadays, we've got 89% with a high school diploma. compare this to 41% in 1960. You had in 1960, you had 8% of Americans graduating college. Now we have 32%. So there's an increase in the education as well as the availability of consumer goods. And this increase in the education translates to increases in labor productivity. So what are we talking about when we talk about labor productivity? So productivity is literally just the total output of an economy, a state, it could be Shadron, right? Divided by the number of people employed. How much stuff can you make with X amount of people? And this is my output per employed worker. Because you can be a worker but be unemployed. And so in 2019, the average U.S. worker produced 5 times more than in the 1930s. Part of this has to do with education. Part of it has to do with capital goods. Has to do with labor-saving technical change. And so productivity growth is one of those key factors to economic growth. I mean, they just go hand in hand. Economic growth is just the growth rate of total output. Productivity growth is the growth rate of total output per employed worker. And we've had some different phases of productivity over the years. So in 1950 to 1973, these were kind of the boom times where we had productivity increases of more than 2% per year. And then 1974 to 1995, we saw a slowdown, and it was closer to about 1% per year. Then we had a pickup between 1996 and 2007 because of computers and the internet and all the productivity gains there. And so this one was between 1% and 2% per year. And lately, we've been hovering around 1% again. Which isn't bad, but it really puts a limit on how much economic growth, how much productivity, or how much standard of living growth we can enjoy. Now, it's important to keep in mind when we're looking at these numbers, we can both compare our economy with ourselves. We can also compare our economy with our neighbors and our peers. So if we look at productivity and living standards in the United States as compared to China. So China's abbreviation is PRC because it's the People's Republic of China. It's their technical name. So the United States had an output in 2018 of about $20.5 billion. China had an output of 13.7 Gesundheit. The population of the United States is 327 million compared to 1.4 billion in China. The labor force in the United States is 159 million compared to China's, which is 756 million. So now here's where we're going to crunch things a little bit. So now we're going to talk about, well, what's the output per person? So if everybody got the same amount of money, which we know is not true, right? There's vast economic inequality between, both in China and in the United States. But for the sake of, just being able to compare apples to apples, the output per person for the United States is $62,673, and the output per person for China is $9,769. So stark differences there. If we look at the average labor productivity, for the United States is $128,000 per worker. And the average labor productivity in China is about 18 grand per worker. So it's important for us to use these fractions because upon first blush, it seems that, that China has a larger economy, or they're producing more, and then when we kind of take a look at it, well, what is it per person and what is it per employed person, we start to see a very different picture, right? Where we see, that America's efficiency is much greater in terms of its productivity. Any questions on those compare and contrasts there? All right. So, dovetailing off of that unemployment and employment thing, let's go take a look at the unemployment rate. And so here we see the unemployment rate from 2001. I think, let's reset this in. So that's about as far back as it goes, which is fine. Unemployment spiked up in the Great Depression in 1930s and stuff, but since then it's really been hovering around 5 to 10. Besides the recent periods, there was a little bit of spiking in the 70s, but so these shaded regions here are depressions, right? Shaded area are recessions or depressions, and so we see that during these recessions, the unemployment rate jumps up significantly. So the unemployment rate is talking about the number of people that are looking for work that cannot find work. And so, everybody in class right now is not technically part of the labor force because you're a student. Also, your grandma who's retired over 65, she's also not part of the labor force. Your brother who's 5 is not part of the labor force. But anybody that's 18 to 65 that's not a student who's actively looking for work. So you also got some people that are just like independently wealthy, right? Or you have some people that are, drug dealers. They're like illegal, right? They're outside of the job market, right? So they would not be counted in terms of unemployment numbers. So this is saying that 10% of the people who are working or looking for a job, actively looking for a job, could not find a job. And so that increased from 5%, 4% to 9%, within, less than a year. And then we had this crazy blip here, right? The COVID-19 blip, where it goes from 3.5% all the way up to a maximum of 14.8%. And recently we've been coming down. We're now down to 5% unemployment, which is part of the reason why you guys are seeing now hiring signs all the time, right? Now hiring again. Haha, now hiring. It's like, it's not funny. And a lot of times you go into those places and you're like, well, how much are you paying? And they're like, oh, $4 an hour plus tips. And you're like, well, how much are tips? They're like, $5 an hour usually. And you're like, yeah, that's why you're hiring, because you're not paying enough. But anyways, so this unemployment rates, there's different kinds of unemployment rates that we can look at. So we can look at unemployment rate for people 25 and older by different educational attainment. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics really breaks it down between, so these are all the people who have less than a high school diploma. They obviously have the greatest unemployment rate of everybody, right? That's why we're here. We're here so that we can, hopefully guarantee, or not guarantee, but increase our chances of getting a high-paying job. If you graduate graduate high school but no college, well, you're going to be in this tier. So it's still going to be better, but not as good as the people who have done some college or associate's degrees, and the very lowest is a bachelor's degree and higher. Right, so those people enjoy the lowest unemployment rate of all of the groups, which again is the reason why we're here. So as we can see, the unemployment rate always rises during recessions. And the other thing that we notice here, why does the unemployment rate never hit zero? Never hit zero, even for those college-educated people, right? So we're going to learn about this in a chapter later on, but essentially there's a natural rate of unemployment. And this actually, it's funny because way before economics, like neoclassical economics existed, Karl Marx talked about this, what was called the reserve army of labor. And he talked about how having these extra laborers waiting in the wings is a great enforcement mechanism for the capitalists, for the people that run the firms, because they can say, well, if you don't like it, there's somebody who's willing to take your job. There's somebody would be, totally dying to take your job, right? And so there's a similar, not as nefarious concept in neoclassical economics called the natural adjusted for inflation rate of unemployment. And it essentially says that, we're never going to get to zero unemployment. A small amount of unemployment is necessary because there is different kinds of unemployment. Like, say you're leaving one job and getting another job, right? You might have a period of being unemployed there. When you guys are done with school, right? Between graduating college and getting a job, there might be a small period there. You might be what's called structurally unemployed, which is, what's going to happen to all these truck drivers as soon as the Cybertruck, releases, right? All these truck drivers are going to be, structurally, they're not going to have a job anymore. They were skilled as these CDL drivers, and all of a sudden, all the CDL driver jobs are just going to disappear. And so there's going to be unemployment that's a result of that. And it's not necessarily any fault of the government or of the Federal Reserve. So we'll talk about who they are and what they do later. But they're people that are essentially in charge of both controlling the price levels and controlling the unemployment rate. So the price levels and unemployment rate are related. So we're going to get to that later, but they're essentially inversely related. So yeah, long rant about the chart there. Back to notes. So unemployment rates are going to differ from country to country. So, for instance, for the past 20 years, the European workforce has had over 10% unemployment. European unemployment is double U.S. unemployment. But this is weird because during the 1950s and 60s, the European unemployment rate was actually lower. And so this is, we're going to find out more in a future chapter. Would you like to know more? Stay tuned. So the last thing we'll talk about is the inflation rate. Not what I want. Give me a graph. Demand release tables. Oh, I'll give you feedback later. All right, so 12-month percentage change in the consumer price index for all these different categories. So we can break it down by different categories. So this is telling us how much these different goods have increased in cost. So in the last 12 months, food has increased by 3.4%. Freaking gasoline has increased by 24%. All other items besides food and gasoline have increased by 4.3%. If we click into that, commodities less energy and food services, we click into that, we find, okay, apparel's increased by 4.2, new vehicles have increased by 6.4, used cars and trucks, the price has increased by 41%. I need to sell that Subaru that's sitting in my front lawn. I think I can probably get some more money than I could have last year, right? Medical care and commodities has actually taken a decrease in the price. I wonder what's going on there. Maybe all the virtual stuff, I don't know. Alcoholic beverages have increased a little bit, and tobacco and smoking products have increased as well. So you can kind of go in here and, you know, click around, and it tells you. So they're the people in charge of figuring out what's going on with our prices and whether or not they should interfere with it. So this talks about different prices here. We can talk about bananas. We could talk about just white bread. We could put chicken in there, eggs, ground chuck, milk, right? So what the CPI does is it combines all these things, right? What do you guys notice about these things? These are all everyday household things that we usually buy, right? Bread, oranges, tomatoes, electricity, gasoline. And so they take a look at all of these things and they weight them depending on how much we typically spend on them every month. And that's what's the 5% increase in overall prices or whatever the case may be, right? But if we want to, we can go ahead and we can take a look at the individual, you know, milk has gone from, you know, they've even got the price here, right? Where it was, you know, $3 and now it's all the way up to $3.63, right? So we'll talk more about this, inflation rate, unemployment rate, all that stuff in class on Monday. You'll have another adaptive assignment. It'll go up live today. Do it sometime over the weekend. Send me emails with any questions that you have. I'll throw this video up on YouTube. Have a great weekend.